They fired her, minutes before she became the only reason a billionaire's grandmother survived that night. Sophie Miller stood frozen at the edge of the marble patio, her fingers still clenched around the damp towel she had been using just seconds ago, the sound of laughter and clinking glasses echoing behind her like she had already been erased from the room, like she never existed in the first place, and maybe to them, she didn't, because to the Whitmore guests she was just the pool girl, the invisible one, the girl who cleaned up after people who would never remember her name, and now she wasn't even that anymore, because just 5 minutes earlier, her supervisor had leaned in close, voice low and sharp, and told her she was done. No explanation, no warning, just, you're not needed anymore. Grab your things and go. And just like that, Sophie's last paycheck, her rent, her already fragile life, all of it felt like it was slipping through her fingers, and as she turned to leave, heels clicking behind her, someone laughed a little too loudly, and she knew without looking they were laughing at something else, but it still felt like it was about her. It always did, and she kept walking anyway, past the glowing pool lights reflecting against the perfectly still water, past the towering glass windows of the mansion where the party continued without interruption, until she heard it, a small, almost unnoticeable splash, the kind of sound most people would ignore, especially at a party like this. But Sophie had spent months working here, learning every sound this place made. And something about that splash didn't belong. It was too soft, too delayed, like something had fallen where it shouldn't have, and she hesitated, just for a second, her mind racing, telling her it wasn't her problem anymore, telling her to keep walking, to not turn back, because no one had turned back for her. But then another sound followed, not a splash this time, but something quieter, something that made her chest tighten, and before she could stop herself, she turned around, her eyes scanning the dim edge of the pool, the blue light flickering against the water, and that's when she saw it. A figure, barely visible, floating near the far end, motionless, the elegant outline of a woman's dress drifting beneath the surface, and Sophie's heart slammed against her ribs because she recognized that silhouette immediately. Eleanor Whitmore, the grandmother everyone whispered about, the one person at this party who had ever looked Sophie in the eye like she mattered, and suddenly the world around her went silent, the music, the laughter, all of it fading into nothing as the reality hit her all at once. The water was cold, colder than anyone realized, barely above 50 degrees, and Eleanor hadn't moved. Not once, and Sophie's breath caught, because she knew exactly what that meant. She knew what happened when someone stayed in water like that too long, and for a split second, she didn't move, her feet rooted to the ground as every thought crashed into her at once. The humiliation, the anger, the way they had just thrown her out like she was nothing, and a voice in her head whispered that this wasn't her responsibility anymore, that she owed them nothing. But then, just as quickly, another thought cut through everything else, clear and undeniable. Eleanor had been kind to her, just once, just enough, and that was all it took. And Sophie dropped the towel, kicked off her shoes, and ran toward the pool without thinking about what would happen next, because in that moment, none of it mattered except the woman who wasn't moving. The cold hit Sophie like a wall the second she broke the surface, stealing the air from her lungs and sending a sharp shock through her entire body. But she forced herself forward, her arms cutting through the freezing water as fast as she could, her eyes locked on Eleanor's still form just a few feet away, and with every movement, her muscles screamed in protest, the temperature making it harder to breathe, harder to think. But she did not stop because she knew she could not now, not when. She was this close, and when she finally reached Eleanor, she grabbed onto her, her hands trembling as she tried to keep both of them afloat, her voice shaking as she called out, even though she knew no one could hear her over the music, over the laughter that continued just beyond the glass doors. And for a moment it felt unreal, like two completely different worlds existed at once, one filled with warmth and celebration, and this one, silent and freezing, where every second mattered more than anything else. And Sophie adjusted her grip, pulling Eleanor's head above the water, trying to keep her steady as she turned toward the edge of the pool, calculating the distance, knowing it was only about 10 feet, but feeling like a mile in the icy water. And she pushed forward, inch by inch, her legs growing heavier, her fingers losing strength, but she refused to let go, repeating in her mind that she just had to make it to the edge, just a little further, just a little more, and finally her hand hit the side of the pool, the smooth stone feeling like the only solid thing left in the world, and she used whatever strength she had left to pull Eleanor closer, lifting her arm onto the edge, then her shoulder, struggling to keep balance, as the cold tried to drag her back down. And it took everything she had to push Eleanor up enough so that her upper body rested on the ground, safe, out of the water, and Sophie stayed there for a second, clinging to the edge, gasping for breath as the cold settled deeper into her bones, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. But she forced herself to move again, pulling herself out of the pool, collapsing beside Eleanor as the reality of what just happened rushed over her all at once, and for a brief moment, there was nothing but silence, no music, no voices, just the sound of her own breathing and the faint ripple of water behind her. And then suddenly everything changed. The door swung open, voices rose, footsteps rushed toward them, and bright lights flooded the poolside, people gathering in confusion and shock, their conversations overlapping as they tried to understand what they were seeing. And Sophie barely had time to process it before someone pointed at her, their voice, sharp and accusing, asking what happened, demanding answers. And before she could even speak, another voice cut through, louder, filled with suspicion, saying she should not have been there, saying she was already fired. And why was she still on the property? And the questions came faster, harsher, twisting the moment into something else entirely, something she had not expected. And Sophie tried to explain, her voice unsteady as she said she found Eleanor in the water, that she pulled her out. But the words did not seem to land the way she hoped, because doubt had already spread across their faces. And someone whispered something that made her stomach drop, suggesting that maybe she had something to do with it, that maybe she was trying to cover something up. And suddenly the looks around her changed, from confusion to suspicion, from concern to quiet judgment. And Sophie felt that familiar feeling again, the one she knew too well, of being seen as less, as someone easy to blame, someone whose voice did not carry the same weight as theirs. And as she sat there, soaked and shaking, her heart racing, she realized that saving Eleanor might not be the end of this moment. It might only be the beginning of something far more complicated than she ever expected. The voices around Sophie grew louder, sharper, cutting through the cold that still clung to her skin, and she could feel every pair of eyes on her as if they had already decided what to believe before she could even finish a sentence, her wet clothes dripping onto the polished stone beneath her as she tried to steady her breathing. But it was getting harder to focus, harder to think clearly with the accusations piling up around her, someone insisting that she should not even be there anymore, another questioning how she ended up alone by the pool with Eleanor in the first place. And Sophie opened her mouth to respond again, her voice trembling as she repeated that she found her in the water, that she jumped in to help. But the words felt smaller this time, weaker against the rising doubt in the air, and for a moment she wondered if anyone would actually listen, if anyone would even consider that she might be telling the truth. Because the way they were looking at her now, it was not curiosity, it was judgment, the kind she had seen too many times before, the kind that did not need proof. And just as that thought settled in, she noticed movement beside her, a subtle shift that pulled her attention away from the crowd, and she turned quickly, her heart catching as she saw Eleanor's hand move ever so slightly against the stone, a faint but undeniable sign. And without thinking, Sophie leaned closer, her voice softer now as she called out to her, hoping, waiting, and for a second nothing happened, the world holding its breath in that fragile pause, until Eleanor's eyes slowly opened, unfocused at first, then blinking against the bright lights above, and a ripple moved through the crowd as people realized she was conscious, their voices dropping into hushed murmurs as they leaned in closer, trying to catch what would happen next. And Sophie felt a small surge of relief push through the fear, because this was it. This was the moment everything could be cleared, the moment Eleanor could speak, could explain, could confirm what really happened. And Sophie stayed still, her hands resting lightly on the ground as she watched Eleanor try to gather herself, her breathing shallow but steady, her gaze shifting slowly across the faces around her until it finally landed on Sophie. And in that brief connection, something unspoken passed between them, something calm and certain that cut through all the noise. and Sophie held on to that moment, hoping it meant what she thought it did. But before Eleanor could say anything, one of the guests stepped forward, their voice quick and urgent, asking if she was all right, asking what happened, layering questions one over another as if filling the silence before it could become something meaningful. And Sophie felt the tension rise again, the fragile clarity of the moment slipping as the crowd pressed closer, and she realized how easily the truth could still be lost, how quickly it could be buried under assumptions and interruptions. And then suddenly the sound of footsteps approached from behind the group, slower but commanding, the kind that did not need to rush to be noticed, and the crowd instinctively shifted, parting just enough to reveal Ryan Whitmore stepping into view, his expression unreadable as his eyes moved from Eleanor to Sophie, then to the surrounding guests, taking in the entire scene without a single word. And something about his presence changed the atmosphere instantly, the noise quieting, the questions stopping midair as attention turned fully toward him, and Sophie felt her pulse quicken again, because this was someone who mattered here, someone whose judgment would carry weight. And as he took another step closer, his gaze settling more firmly on her, she could not tell what he was thinking, whether he believed what he was seeing or something else entirely. And in that suspended moment, with the cold still gripping her and the crowd waiting in silence, Sophie realized that everything now depended on what would be said next, and whether the truth would finally be heard or completely rewritten. Ryan Whitmore did not speak right away, and somehow that silence felt heavier than all the accusations that came before it, his eyes steady as they moved across the scene again, taking in every detail with a calm that made everyone else uneasy. And Sophie could feel that gaze linger on her just a moment longer than the others, not accusing, not forgiving either, just searching, as if he was trying to piece together something that no one else had the patience to understand. And the crowd waited, almost holding its breath, because when someone like Ryan finally spoke, it mattered. But before he could say anything, Eleanor shifted again, a small movement, but enough to draw his attention instantly, and he stepped forward without hesitation, kneeling beside her, his voice low and controlled as he called her name, asking if she could hear him, if she was all right. And for a second it seemed like the rest of the world faded away for him, like nothing else mattered except making sure she was safe. And Sophie watched quietly, her hands still trembling slightly against the cold stone, unsure if she should speak again or stay silent, unsure if anything she said would even make a difference now. And then Eleanor blinked slowly, her gaze clearing just enough to focus on Ryan, and her lips parted as if she was trying to form words, the effort visible but fragile. And the people around them leaned in just a little closer, waiting, hoping, and maybe even fearing what she might say, because in this moment, her voice carried more truth than anyone else's. And Sophie felt her chest tighten as she realized this was it, the moment everything could turn, and she held her breath without even noticing, her eyes fixed on Eleanor, willing her to speak, to say what really happened, to cut through the confusion that had built so quickly. And then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, Eleanor spoke, slow and unsteady but clear enough for those closest to hear, and Ryan leaned in slightly, listening carefully as she said just a few words, simple but powerful. And as those words reached him, something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, not in a way that drew attention immediately, but enough that the tension in his face softened just a fraction, and he glanced toward Sophie again, this time with a different kind of focus, something more certain. And the change did not go unnoticed, because people began to look between them, trying to read what had just been said without actually hearing it, trying to interpret the silent exchange unfolding right in front of them. And one of the guests spoke up again, unable to contain the curiosity, asking what Eleanor had said, asking if she was hurt, if she remembered anything, their voice filled with urgency, but also something else, something cautious, as if they were not entirely sure what answer they wanted to hear. And Ryan stood slowly, his posture straight, his presence once again commanding the attention of everyone around him. And when he finally spoke, his voice was calm but firm, cutting cleanly through the air as he addressed the situation without raising his tone. And he said that Eleanor needed space, that someone should call for medical assistance immediately, and that no one should jump to conclusions without understanding what actually happened. And those words alone shifted the energy, not completely, but enough to quiet the louder accusations, enough to create a pause where there had only been noise before, and Sophie felt a small, almost unfamiliar sense of relief begin to surface, not because everything was resolved, but because for the first time since this started, someone had not immediately assumed the worst about her. And as Ryan's gaze returned to her once more, steady and deliberate, she realized that whatever happened next, the truth was closer to being heard than it had been just moments ago, but it still was not fully out in the open, and until it was, everything remained uncertain, hanging in that fragile space between doubt and belief. The shift in the atmosphere did not erase the tension completely, but it slowed it down just enough for reality to start catching up with assumptions. And as people stepped back to give Eleanor space, a staff member rushed off to call for medical help, while others whispered more quietly now, their earlier confidence fading into uncertainty, and Sophie remained where she was, sitting on the cold stone, her body still shaking not only from the freezing water, but from everything that had just unfolded, her mind trying to process how quickly she had gone from invisible to the center of attention, and not in the way anyone would ever want. And she could feel the weight of damp fabric clinging to her skin, the chills settling deeper with every passing second. But she barely noticed anymore, because all her focus was on what Ryan had just said, on the way he had not accused her, on the way he had paused before speaking, as if he actually wanted to understand, and that alone felt different from everything else she had experienced tonight. And as she slowly pushed herself up to stand, unsteady but determined, she caught a few glances from the crowd, some still skeptical, others softer now, unsure, like they were reconsidering what they thought they knew. And it was in that fragile moment of hesitation that one of the staff members spoke up quietly, almost reluctantly, mentioning that there were security cameras covering the pool area, and the words hung in the air for a second, before their meaning fully landed, because suddenly there was a way to see the truth, not guess it, not argue about it, but actually see what happened, and a subtle ripple moved through the group again, people exchanging looks, some nodding slightly, others stiffening as if they had not expected that possibility, and Sophie felt her heart skip, not out of fear this time, but something closer to hope, because she knew what those cameras would show, she knew exactly what happened out there. And for the first time since the accusation started, she realized she might not have to rely on words alone, and Ryan seemed to recognize the importance of that as well, because he turned toward the staff member who mentioned it, his expression focused as he asked where the footage could be accessed, his tone calm, but leaving no room for delay, and the staff member quickly explained that it could be pulled up inside the house, in a private office just off the main hall, and Ryan nodded once, decisive, before glancing back at Eleanor, making sure she was being cared for, and then back at Sophie, and for a brief moment their eyes met again, and this time there was something clearer there, something closer to acknowledgement, as if he was beginning to see her not just as part of the situation, but as a person within it, and Sophie felt that small shift more than she expected, because after everything, being seen even a little differently felt significant, and as the group began to move toward the house, some out of concern, others out of curiosity, Sophie hesitated for just a second, unsure if she should follow, unsure if she was even allowed to be part of what came next after being told to leave, but before she could decide, Ryan spoke again, not loudly, but clearly enough for her to hear, telling her to come with them. And it was a simple statement, but it carried weight, cutting through any doubt about whether she belonged in that moment. And Sophie took a breath, steadying herself as best as she could before stepping forward to follow, the cold still clinging to her, the uncertainty not fully gone. But something had changed, something important, because now the truth was no longer just something she hoped people would believe. It was something they were about to see for themselves. And as they moved inside, leaving the quiet, dim pool behind, Sophie realized that whatever happened next would not just determine how others saw her. It might change the course of her life in ways she had not imagined just hours ago. The warmth inside the mansion hit Sophie almost as sharply as the cold water had moments before, but it did little to stop the shivering that still ran through her body as she followed behind the group, her wet shoes in her hand, leaving faint watermarks across the polished floor, and she could feel the contrast everywhere, the golden lights, the soft music still playing in distant rooms, the quiet elegance that made everything look untouched by what had just happened outside, and yet the Tension traveled with them, lingering in every glance and every hushed whisper as people tried to piece together their own versions of the story. And Sophie kept her eyes forward, focusing on Ryan as he led the way with calm certainty, his presence steady, not rushed, but purposeful, as if he had already decided that the truth mattered more than the assumptions surrounding it. And they reached a quiet hallway away from the noise of the party, where the atmosphere shifted again, more controlled, more private, and a staff member quickly stepped ahead to unlock a door, revealing a sleek office lined with screens and soft lighting. And without hesitation, Ryan stepped inside, gesturing for the others to follow, and Sophie paused at the threshold for a brief second, suddenly aware of how out of place she must look, soaked, pale, still catching her breath, standing in a room that felt like it belonged to a completely different world. But before doubt could stop her, she stepped in anyway. Because this moment was no longer about fitting in, it was about being seen clearly, and the staff member moved to the control panel, their hands working quickly but carefully as they began pulling up the security footage, and the room grew quiet. Not the chaotic silence from before, but something more focused, more intense, as everyone's attention shifted to the screens, waiting, watching, and Sophie could hear her own heartbeat again, steady but strong, as anticipation built in the room. Because this was it, the point where everything would either confirm what she had said or somehow twist it into something else entirely, and the screen flickered to life, showing the pool area from earlier that evening, calm, undisturbed, the water reflecting the soft lights around it, and the timestamp in the corner began to move as the footage played. And at first, nothing unusual happened, just the empty pool, the quiet surroundings, and Sophie felt a flicker of doubt try to creep in, not about what happened, but about how it would be seen, how it would be interpreted. But then a figure appeared. On the screen, Eleanor, walking slowly toward the edge of the pool, her steps careful but slightly unsteady, and the room leaned in collectively, every eye fixed on the image, and Sophie held her breath again as the moment approached, watching as Eleanor paused near the water, looking out across the surface, and then, in a small but sudden movement, she lost her balance, her foot slipping just enough to send her forward, and the next second, she was in the pool, the water rippling outward in a quiet splash that matched exactly what Sophie had heard earlier, and a murmur moved through the room, softer this time, more uncertain, as the first piece of the truth revealed itself clearly on the screen, and the footage continued, showing the empty space again for a few seconds, no one rushing in, no one noticing, just the stillness of the water and Eleanor struggling beneath the surface. And then, moments later, another figure entered the frame, Sophie, running toward the pool without hesitation, and the way it unfolded left no room for doubt, no space for interpretation, because everything was right there, visible, undeniable, the exact sequence of events that Sophie had tried to explain. And as she watched herself on that screen, diving into the freezing water, pulling Eleanor toward the edge, fighting against the cold, Sophie felt something shift inside her, not just relief, but validation. Because for the first time that night, the truth was no longer fragile or dependent on belief. It was solid, clear, and impossible to ignore, and the room fell into a deeper silence as the footage played on, and in that silence, everything began to change. No one spoke for several seconds. After the footage ended, and the silence this time was not filled with suspicion but with realization, the kind that settles slowly and forces people to confront what they had just witnessed. And Sophie stood there, still damp, still cold, but no longer invisible, because every eye in that room had just seen exactly what she did, not as a story, not as a defense, but as undeniable truth, and she could feel the shift in the air, subtle but powerful, as doubt gave way to something else, something closer to respect, or at the very least, acknowledgement. And one of the guests let out a quiet breath, almost like they had been holding it the entire time, while another looked down briefly, as if reconsidering their earlier words, and the same voices that once questioned her now had nothing to say, because there was nothing left to question. And Sophie did not move, not yet, because part of her was still catching up to the moment, still processing how quickly everything had changed, how just minutes ago she had been blamed, and now she stood here with the truth laid out in front of everyone. And then Ryan stepped forward slightly, his gaze still fixed on the screen for a brief moment before turning towards Sophie. And there was no hesitation this time, no uncertainty, just a clear understanding in his expression as he took in what had happened. And when he spoke, his voice was calm but carried a weight that filled the room without effort. And he said that what they had just seen spoke for itself, that Sophie had acted without hesitation when no one else was there, and that she had done something not many people would have had the courage to do, especially after being treated the way she had been. And the words were simple, but they landed differently than anything before, because they were not just an observation, they were recognition, and Sophie felt something in her chest loosen slightly, a tension she had been holding without realizing it. And as Ryan continued, he made it clear that assumptions had been made too quickly, that judgment had come before understanding, and that it should not have happened that way. And there was no anger in his tone, but there was a quiet firmness that made people listen, and slowly, one by one, the others began to respond, not with arguments, but with small acknowledgments, a nod here, a quiet apology there, not all at once, not dramatic, but real enough to show that something had shifted. And Sophie listened, unsure how to react, because this was not something she was used to, not in places like this, not from people like them. And she glanced briefly at the screen again, seeing the final frame frozen there. The moment she reached Eleanor, and it felt distant now, like something that had happened much longer ago than it actually had. And yet its impact was just beginning to unfold, and Ryan turned slightly toward the staff member who had been operating the system, thanking them before asking that the footage be saved, his tone still steady, still in control. And then his attention returned to Sophie once more, and for a moment, the room seemed to fade again, not because of chaos this time, but because of focus, because this was no longer just about what had happened. It was about what came next, and Sophie felt that weight too. The sense that this moment was not just closing something, but opening something else entirely, something she had not planned for, something she could not fully predict. And as the quiet settled around them, it became clear that the story was not ending here. It was only beginning to take a new direction. The silence that followed did not feel heavy anymore. It felt clear, like something had finally settled into place, and Sophie stood there trying to understand what that meant for her, because moments like this did not usually happen in her world, not where things turned around this quickly, not where people actually stopped and reconsidered. And yet here she was, still damp, still shaking slightly, but no longer overlooked. And she could feel it in the way people looked at her now, not with suspicion, but with something quieter, something closer to respect, even if they did not say it out loud. And Ryan took a small step closer, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance in a way that felt intentional. And when he spoke again, his tone remained calm but carried a new layer of sincerity, as if what he was about to say mattered beyond just the situation itself. And he said that what Sophie had done tonight was not something that could be dismissed or reduced to a simple thank you. That stepping into freezing water without hesitation, especially after everything she had just experienced, showed a kind of character that was rare. And Sophie listened, her mind still catching up, because no one had ever described her actions that way before. No one had ever framed something she did as meaningful in a room like this. And for a second she did not know how to respond. Her instinct was still to step back, to minimize it, to say it was nothing, but the words stayed in her chest, because for once, it did not feel like nothing. And Ryan continued, saying that mistakes had been made tonight, not by her, but by the people who were too quick to judge, and that included the way she had been treated before any of this even happened. And a few of the staff members shifted slightly at that, their expressions tightening with quiet acknowledgement. And Sophie felt a flicker of something unexpected, not satisfaction, not even relief exactly, but recognition, the kind that does not erase what happened but makes it harder to ignore. And then Ryan paused briefly, as if choosing his next words carefully, and he said that actions like hers deserved more than just acknowledgement. They deserved opportunity, and that word hung in the air, differently than everything else, because it pointed forward, not backward. And Sophie felt her attention sharpen without even realizing it, her mind focusing on what that could mean. And Ryan explained that he wanted to offer her something beyond a simple reward, something that reflected what he had just seen, not just in the footage, but in her decision to act when it mattered. And the room seemed to lean in again, curiosity returning, but in a different form this time, not questioning, but wondering, and Sophie felt her heartbeat pick up slightly, not from fear, but from uncertainty about what was coming next, because this was no longer about proving what happened. That part was over. This was something else entirely, something she had not prepared for, and Ryan's gaze remained steady as he looked at her, not past her, not through her, but directly at her, and in that moment, it felt like everything had narrowed down to just the two of them, the rest of the room fading into the background, and Sophie realized that whatever he was about to say next could change more than just how this night ended. It could change everything that came after, and for the first time since she was told to leave earlier, she was not thinking about walking away. She was thinking about what it might mean to stay. Ryan held that moment just long enough for the weight of his words to settle before continuing, his voice steady as he said that what Sophie showed tonight was not just courage but instinct, the kind that cannot be taught easily, and that his family valued people who acted when it mattered most, not when it was convenient. And Sophie listened carefully, every word landing with more impact than she expected, because this was not just about gratitude anymore. It was about recognition in a way she had never experienced before, and Ryan went on to explain that he wanted to offer her a position within his company, not as temporary help, not as someone overlooked, but as someone who would be trained, supported, and given a real chance to build something stable, something long-term. And the room grew even quieter, the kind of silence that follows something unexpected, something that shifts the direction of everything. And Sophie felt her breath catch slightly as she processed what he was saying, because this was more than she had imagined, more than she had even allowed herself to consider. And for a second she hesitated, not because she did not want it, but because it felt almost too far from the life she had been living just hours ago. And Ryan seemed to understand that hesitation, because he added that there was no pressure to decide immediately, that what mattered most was that she knew the opportunity was real, and that it was being offered because of who she had shown herself to be, not because of circumstance. And Sophie nodded slowly, her thoughts moving quickly, now connecting pieces of her life that had always felt uncertain, always temporary. And for the first time, there was something in front of her that felt different, something that had the potential to last. And before she could respond, the door opened behind them, and a staff member stepped in, quietly informing Ryan that Eleanor was awake again and asking for him. And the shift in the room was immediate, attention turning back to the reason all of this had started, and Ryan acknowledged it with a small nod before looking back at Sophie one more time, his expression softer now, less formal. And he said that they would talk more after he checked on his grandmother, and that she should stay, not as an employee, not as someone waiting for instructions, but as a guest. And that distinction alone carried meaning Sophie could feel even if she did not fully understand it yet. And as Ryan stepped out of the room, others began to move again, quieter, more thoughtful, the earlier tension completely replaced by something calmer. And Sophie remained where she was for a moment, letting everything settle, the cold finally beginning to fade, replaced by something warmer, something steady. And she glanced once more at the screen where the footage still lingered, a reminder of how quickly everything had changed. And she realized that tonight had not just been about saving someone. It had been about being seen in a way she never had before. And as she took a slow breath and stepped forward, following the direction Ryan had gone, she understood that this was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something she had not expected, something that was still unfolding. And whatever came next, she was no longer standing outside of it. She was part of it.